we're going to be talking about extremely very beginning colonial research. And I'm going to do that by telling you about Anne Marbury Hutchinson and her story, which I think is fascinating personally. But I started researching her. She was someone I was interested in, so I just started researching her. And of course, she lived during the colonial time in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And that led me to beginning to find some colonial information. I didn't set out to teach myself how to do colonial research. I had no special education or knowledge. I just started looking at Anne. But I did learn some things, some key things about how to get started doing that colonial research. And what I'll show you is very basic, very beginner, but it is a great launch pad to get yourself involved. And my hope is that it will build your confidence in doing colonial research so that you'll just dive in and get started and start finding information. The key, the key to the whole thing is to know the area history. And you'll hear this over and over again about how when we're doing genealogy research, it's important to know the history. But to me, it is especially important when you're doing colonial research, because if you know the history of the area, you can begin to get to know the records that may be available. You can learn how to do a records survey to see what records survived, what records still exist. You can dive in and learn about people's day-to-day lives. It's very important to study the formation of the place. So why was this community established? Where did it come from? Where did the people come from? What are the dates? And just learn everything possible that you can about that area. And then start to research for your specific ancestor within the records that are available for that area. You'll do a much more informed, in-depth search for your ancestor if you do that area history research first. But if for some reason you don't find information about your ancestor or their family, you already know a lot about them because you know about where they lived, you know about what was going on around them, you know about what their day-to-day life was likely like, and all of that begins to inform your research and begins to tell you about them as a person. And so that's very important. We're not learning just birth dates and death dates and burial locations. We're actually learning about the person's life, which to me is more valuable than dates. So, in looking at Anne Hutchinson, um, she lived in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. I knew that. And so I started looking at um, finding New England records and doing some New England research. And I learned that English churches across the pond, England churches began recording baptisms, marriages, and burials about 70 years before colonization in America started. That is great for us because that means when people begin to come here, they were already established in that habit of registering these events. That means that those records here were started much earlier than they would have been if that was a foreign concept to them. So, for example, in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, I learned that they started requiring town clerks to record the births and deaths by 1639. And it was important to them. That's emphasized by the fact that by 1644, there's a penalty if you failed to register. So that doesn't mean that everybody registered. Some people could have just taken a chance of getting caught not registering or being willing to pay that penalty. But It tells us that the leadership thought that that was important and that they encouraged that registration to occur. Another thing that I learned in just general history research of the area at the time is that churches were extremely important. This community was established as a religious safe haven away from the practices that were going on in England. And so, of course, churches and the information therein are important to them. When you're looking at records during this time, though, if you're using a church register, note that they register baptisms and burials. They're not registering births and deaths per se. They're registering the ceremonies around those events, which for us in genealogy, that's going to be a very close time frame. So if I know when someone was buried, I can estimate that they died very close to that time, et cetera, et cetera. So even though you may not find a death record, but you find a burial record, that's really close for us in genealogy for that time frame. And I'm very happy if I find something that close. To find those parish and church registers, you can just do a general internet search. So, for example, for the Boston records, I searched for Boston church records and began to find a lot of resources that were outside of dedicated genealogy websites. However, you can find records, local records for on these dedicated genealogy websites. And I'm going to show you two of probably the most popular out of what we use, but the same general concept works on no matter what database you're working on. For Ancestry, if you are on their main search page, you can scroll all the way to the bottom. And when you scroll to the bottom, they have a map, but they also have these headers to begin to break down where you want to look. So you can look for the United States and you can look for a specific state in there, or you could look for like the UK or Ireland or Scotland or whatever. You can click on the name of the place you want to go, or you can click on the map, which makes it really easy. From there, it is going to pull up a list of all of their locally available databases and records. Family Search works similarly, but it's not a clickable map. Family Search on that catalog page or on the main page, you see across the top, it says records, images, genealogies, catalog. Catalog is what you want to select. And on the catalog page, you want to make sure you have place toggled and you want to enter the place you're interested in. Now, Family Search really likes it if you go from big location on the left to the smaller location on the right. So for Boston, it likes for you to put in United States, Massachusetts, and then the county and the city that you want to look at. It will begin to give you a drop-down list right here. So as you type, even if you just start typing Massachusetts, it'll start giving you a drop-down list located that will overlap right here, and you can choose the location that you want. Anytime that Family Search offers you that drop-down location, you should choose it because it helps that computer find exactly what you want. So I chose the drop-down list here for Boston, and I go ahead and I toggle online only when I start out because I'm not at the Family History Center. I'm sitting at home at my computer, and I just want to see what I can see right now online. So I choose that and I hit search. And that is going to give me a list of everything locally available for that location. And here I've blown this little part up. It's a massive list for Boston, but I've blown this little part up for us so we can look at it. And for example, vital records, there's 34 things to select from. And to look at that, all I have to do is click on this little gray triangle here, and is going to drop that list of 34 things down. This is just a snippet of it. And I can then click on these blue links to find that selection of local records. Now, importantly, it tells me who the author is. And so I try to look when I'm looking for records, I try to look for things that look like they're official records. They are in the custody of the local government, or they were created by the local government, because those to me are more close to original records. Although we're going to find that at this time frame in colonial America, uh, we don't get a lot of access to original records. The records are so old that they have been transcribed. However, I like that this has been done by the city registrar. And so I'm going to click on that. And when I do that, it takes me to that records page. And then here are all these images here where I can start to look for my particular ancestor or information that I want to find. And from there, it's really just a search like you would do for the 1800s or the 1900s. There's nothing magical about colonial research. It is exactly the same process that we go through for every other type of research that we do for every other time frame. You just have to take your time and learn the area history and find out what records are still existing at that time. Now, let me give you a little bit of background about Anne. She was born in England in 1591. Queen Elizabeth was on the throne until 1603. And so in Anne's early life, she got to see a very independent, well-educated woman who thought for herself, lead the country. So that certainly influenced her and let her know that women could do that, that they could voice opinions, that it was okay for them to be educated and have their own thoughts. Her father was named Francis Marbury, and he was a preacher who was a nonconformist. He studied and decided that he disagreed with a lot of things that the church said, and he publicly let his opinions be known, and he got in trouble for that. She watched her father overcome those troubles. She certainly would have been exposed to seeing her country go through a lot of religious turmoil at that time. We had different groups with different opinions. The Puritans broke off and would shortly come to America seeking religious freedom. But within her household growing up, her mother was Puritan, her father was not. And so you have to imagine that there was at least a tolerance for differing opinions in her family and probably some intellectual discussion, because her father believed that education was extremely valuable. And he made sure that she and her siblings were very well educated. Not only that, he spent time with them, partly due to the fact that he was under house arrest some of the time for going against the church and expressing his beliefs. But he spent time with his kids, educating them, discussing things with them, and helping them learn how to apply their knowledge to real life experience, real life situations. She was noted as unafraid and bold and fierce. So these are things that I know about Anne from the very beginning. Now, I wanted to know about her adult life. And so I start to look for who did she marry, what happened. And remember when I said you can go out there and look for local record sets? It doesn't matter if you do that for the United States or if you do that for another country, the process is the same. And so I'm going to show you how I found her marriage record. I chose to look for local records through that search on Ancestry and then drilling down to the location and further and further until I got to London, baptisms, marriages, and burials in the time frame that I needed. And from there, I decided that I would just chance a database search and see if I could find her marriage record that way. And I did. I found her marriage record. And if you're like me, you're just looking at that and thinking, what does that say? It doesn't even look readable. And even if you zoom in on her particular marriage record, it's still very difficult to read. But let me assure you, if you take your time and just go word by word and look at those and spend some time zooming in, you can read them. But it says that she married in August 1612 to William Hutchinson, who was a merchant of Alford, which is exactly Anne's hometown. That's where she was from. That she was the daughter of Francis Marbury, who was a minister. So this is identified that I have the correct Anne Marbury. And it's told me who she married, what her husband's occupation was, and that he was also from Alford. They grew up together. They were childhood friends. William's family was well off. They were a merchant family. They were self-made. They just worked really hard and were successful and made their fortune just out of good, hard work. He had a good reputation. He was not as well educated as Anne was book-wise, but that was okay because he just needed to be extremely business savvy. He didn't need a lot of book knowledge, and so that was fine. He was known to have a calm and peaceful nature, according to the histories that I read. He was certainly loyal, as you'll see. He stuck by Anne through thick and thin as she gets into trouble in America. But again, he was very business oriented and she was more religious oriented. Certainly that makes sense with their different backgrounds from their different families. But they seemed to have a very happy life together. They seemed to be great companions, true companions. After they married, they lived in Alford, England, their hometown, for 22 years. And during that time, they had at least 14 children. They were very comfortable financially. Even after they came to America, they were very comfortable financially. They did not have to worry about resources. In England, they followed Reverend John Cotton. They agreed with his outlook, and he was, by all accounts, very close to them. Now, he was not a fan of religious ceremony. He did not like rituals in the church. And so we're starting to see that division from some other groups in England, away from common practice. He spoke against it so much that the church received a complaint that he was getting away from ritual and ceremony. And he was so outspoken, he really got into trouble. He had to flee England. And so he went to America. John Winthrop was in America. He had established the Massachusetts Bay Colony for religious freedom. And so he went there and he encouraged the Hutchinsons to follow him to America. And so they do. They leave England in the summer of 1634 and they go to Boston aboard a ship called the Griffin. Again, I'm just reading histories and I'm reading about the Massachusetts Bay Colony in general. And I am finding little snippets of information that I'm piecing together to begin to answer these questions that I have about their life. Already in America was John Winthrop. And so of course, he is a well-known figure, and there has been a lot of information written about him in the history of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And it was a wealth of information. I studied and studied and studied all of this before I really started digging into Anne. So that laid for me this great foundation to understand what was going on there. Now, John Winthrop had gone to America 4 years before. He founded Boston. He was a Puritan, he was a lawyer, and he was an on again, off again governor of the area. He would serve as a governor and then sort of get on the outs with the general commonwealth, the people, and he would be kind of set off to the side for a little while and then reelected. And he was in and out a good bit. But he was always there, and he was always a leader of the area, no matter what his position was. Wondering about how the government was structured at that time, because, this is before America was founded. So was it different? What was going on there? And I started doing some very elementary research that helped me understand a lot. Now, in England, the crown was the head of the church. It is exactly flipped when they come to America. When they come to America, there is the New England way or the congregational way. And the state government or the government overall did not control the church here. The church was the center hub of everything. Everything deferred to the church. As a matter of fact, only church members were allowed to be full citizens. This was actually pretty smart on their part. We might cringe about that a little bit, but it was actually pretty smart from a leadership perspective. They needed this group of people to stay very cohesive and very put together and in a tight-knit unit. And so if they have one central group that they can get everybody dedicated to, that is going to reduce the chances that they have fractions within the community and allow them to be much more stable. They had seen other communities come into America earlier, and those communities really struggled to survive. And the reason a lot of them struggled was because people started fracturing one from the other and splitting apart. And so they realized we have got to keep people together and prevent this splitting for us to be able to survive. And so this was the general thought here. So Anne's on the way. She's on the way to America on the Griffin. She hasn't made it yet, but she's already facing difficulty. They had a lot of church services on the ships that came over. I mean, what else did they have to do, right? They had daily chores and things that they needed to have taken care of. But other than that, they really didn't have a lot to do. And people's lives at this time really focused on studying the Bible and studying religion. And so they focused on worship services. They would worship for 4 hours a day. Now, Reverend Sims was preaching on the Griffin, and he began to say that you store up an amount of grace by showing love to your neighbor. And Anne called him out on that. She defied the custom that women were not to speak in mixed company. You did not do that if you were a woman. You could only speak to other women. And she just stepped out there and disagreed with him and said, you're starting to sound like you have a very legalistic flair here, that you're saying that people have to act a certain way in order to receive grace. And they argued about this. Again, she was known to have a very sharp wit and to be very smart and could usually talk circles around people. And so that is what happened on that ship. And it embarrassed him. And he reported her to the church as soon as he got there, which in his defense, that was his duty, right? That was what he should have done at that time frame. So the church then has to admit the Hutchinsons to membership for them to be able to participate in the community. Remember, you had to be a member of the church to be a full citizen. And so they examined William in October and they admitted him. He was fine. But this report about Anne had them a little concerned. And so they took their time looking at her and talking to her and questioning her. And so she was admitted a little bit later. Now, all I did to find this was search Boston church records. And there's a lot of information out there. There's multiple publications that offer Boston church records, which on the surface could be a little confusing. Which one do you choose? And so what I did is I looked at several. I looked at several sources, and I chose one that seemed to preserve the original language of the records as best as possible. We don't have a lot of original records that are accessible to us during this time frame. The records are just so old, right? It's not like going to your courthouse and finding a deed from 1953. We're talking about over 400 or close to 400 years ago. So we kind of have to understand that we're a lot of times going to be looking at records or sources that are not necessarily original records. But again, do due diligence and find reputable sources. So their life in Boston, though, was good after that initial hiccup. William was a merchant, and that is always in demand. He is not only focused on Boston here, but he's also looking at all of the surrounding area, and he's doing business in all of this surrounding area. He's looking at trade routes. He's really building a good, solid life for them. He's also being integrated into the local government, into the local leadership. He was a desirable person to have on the leadership team there because he is a merchant. He has access to a lot of stuff. He is wealthy. And he served as a deputy to the general court. He also served as a selectman, which was similar to a board of aldermen. I don't know any of this stuff before I start doing this research, by the way. All of this stuff, when I read he was a deputy to the general court, I go look that up. When I see that he was a selectman, I say, what does that mean? And I just start doing searches and going and looking that up and educating myself about what that is. So it's a lot of study time about things that are not names, dates, and places. But again, it informs me a lot about the life of my ancestors, right? Now, Anne also had a great life in Boston. She was a midwife by trade, and she was reportedly very good at this. She was extremely knowledgeable, and at that time, medical knowledge is powerful. That is a great resource to have in your corner. She was able to build rapport with most of the women in the community, or a lot of the women in the community. They depended heavily on her, and she was an advocate for them. You know, she helped them. She really wanted them to have good lives and be healthy and have resources available to them. Cotton, her pastor from home, her preacher from home, Reverend John Cotton, came to her and he said, hey, you know, you're in this community, and it would be great if you could get involved with some of the women's study groups. And so she started hosting weekly Bible study groups in her home. And at that time, the way that worked is they would get together and discuss the week's sermon and talk about it even more than it had been talked about on Sunday. And so at that time in Boston, there starts to be this division of viewpoints. There was what is called the covenant of works and the covenant of grace. So it was works versus grace. Both camps believed that you were elected to heaven, to admittance to heaven by God. He was the decider, and he said who was getting into heaven and who wasn't. You were either elected or you weren't. But under a covenant of works, they tended to really embrace rules and laws. They believed that good deeds were evidence of your election to heaven, that it was a very visible representation of your sainthood. If you faltered and made mistakes, it could mean that you weren't saved, that you were not of the elect. There was a lot of peer pressure to be in this group of elected people, to be in this group that was going to heaven. Again, remember, a lot of their life focused on religious stuff. It was extremely important. So it was very important to them that everyone in the community see that they were elected. You wanted to be elected to go to heaven. And they also, to some degree, believed that if you were a person who made mistakes, that was almost contagious. You could contaminate society around you. And so if you made mistakes, sometimes you were ostracized, and that was not good. So the opposite of that, the opposition to that, they still believed you were elected by God, but that was almost the end of the argument. You were elected by God, and it did not matter what your actions were here. They opposed this legalism and this, you have to follow these rules and you have to do these things to show that you're an elect of God. They said that if you did good deeds, it was really just a side effect of being saved. It wasn't necessary to show that you were of the elect. And they also said that Christians make mistakes, but that doesn't jeopardize your salvation. You're either saved or you're not. There is nothing that you can do to overturn God's decision, to sway him as in his decision to let you into heaven or not. So Anne also took it another little step further. She believed that you could communicate with God. John Cotton believed this as well. And their followers, their co-believers, began to see this and believe this. She believed that there was this inner light or inner spirit that could speak to you as an individual. And as that occurred, if you were able to hear that or to communicate directly with God, you could prophesy. Prophesying was possible as a direct or a personal revelation from God. And the conclusion to that is that if you can talk directly with God, you do not need the leadership of the church to help you out with that. This is where it gets to be really, really dangerous, because the leadership of the church was the leadership of the government, was the leadership of the community. It was all the same group. And she is starting to say they might not be needed. We can, on our own, build this relationship with God and have direct revelations from him. Now, remember what I said about they need everybody to stay in a cohesive group and do what they say and do what their rulings are so that they can survive. If this is allowed to continue, they will begin to fracture. And that is not good. So she is dangerous. She's also dangerous because she is a woman, and it's just different. It's if a man is out there saying something, then that's just a manly opinion. If a woman is out there saying something, she's now by her actions overturning the social norms. So she's not only doing it by what she's saying and what she's preaching, but she's doing it by example, and that is scary to them. So I'm wondering, what does Boston even look like at this time? How big is it? What's going on here? And to answer that curiosity, I just go out, I search for Boston maps of the time frame, and I find some Boston maps, and I'm going to zoom in on this red square for you because it hits me like a ton of bricks how important this is. Here's the Hutchinson land. Now, it has Richard, their son's name on it, because he ends up with this this property. But this is where William and Anne live, directly across the street from Governor Winthrop. So the key person here, the founder of Boston, the on again, off again governor, is directly across the street. He is watching Anne's weekly Bible studies, the people coming and going. He knows who her biggest fans are, and it's frightening. It's intimidating because not only does she have Reverend John Cotton, who is the teacher at the Boston church. John Wilson was the head pastor, the head minister. John Cotton was junior to him, but he was a teacher. She has him in her court. John Wheelwright is her brother-in-law, but he also subscribes to the way that she believes. The new governor, Henry Vane, who was young, but he and John Winthrop butted heads, obviously, if he's the new governor and John Winthrop's the old governor. He is a fan of Anne. She has magistrates. Townspeople from neighboring communities begin to travel in to participate in her weekly Bible studies, and those groups are getting large. These are at her home, and she is cramming in 60 to 70 people twice a week. That's a lot. She has a large following at that time. Now, John Winthrop's journal that he kept notes her. He says that she was a woman of ready wit, bold spirit, but that she brought over with her some dangerous errors. Now, manuscripts can be very informative when you're doing some research for the area's history and what's going on there. It can be very telling about the day-to-day lives and some very revealing information there. Most manuscripts are not published online like John Winthrop's are. So if you're looking for your ancestors' information or information about that area, you're probably not going to find them online. There may be some, and it's definitely worth checking out. But a lot of those journals and those manuscripts were donated to archives and libraries and museums. They should have a finding tool or an index for their manuscript collection. And so ask for that. And each place does it a little bit differently. And a lot of times I'll just ask for help. Hey, I'm looking for manuscripts that are going to tell me about day-to-day life in this time frame, in this place. Could you help me look some up? And they will show you how to use their finding tool or their index. And that's really going to shortcut the time that you have to spend trying to decipher all of that. But read the descriptions of the files and the individual manuscripts that are available, and then just go start reading them and looking at them and using them as resources. Family associations also a lot of times have leads on manuscripts that have to do with your particular family. So don't ignore those either. Now, it just happens that because John Winthrop was as prominent as he was, his journal is readily available online. It's on Google Books, it's on JSTOR online, it's on a lot of different places online. And so it is available widely. And, you know, just reading it is extremely revealing for this time frame. But getting back to Anne, she has become so dangerous to them. They don't want her to become any more influential than she already has. And so in 1636, she's called in, and she and John Cotton and her contemporaries are given a chance to sort of explain themselves, and they're trying to give her this opportunity to back off of what her beliefs were and to say, oh, no, I wasn't saying anything against you at all. I'm not going to do that. And then hoping that her behavior would change. She, again, is known to be very quick-witted. and could outthink most people. And so she very successfully is able to sort of skirt out of that. But in 1637, it becomes obvious to the leadership that she's not going to stop and they're going to have to do something. And so they sort of come to this consensus that they've got to put a stop to this. They have got to make sure this colony survives, and they see that her group, the people who are with her, are going to start to really cause some problems and fracture off. So they begin to disenfranchise people around her. They need to neutralize these people and then get rid of Anne. They can't really directly attack Anne as long as she has this deep support system. They've got to attack her support system first, and then they can deal with Anne. So Henry Vane, the governor, is ousted. He's gone. They get rid of him. Then William Hutchinson, her husband, lost his government service positions. He's no longer a selectman. He's no longer serving the community in that capacity. John Wheelwright was Anne's brother-in-law through the Hutchinson side of the family, and he is banished for sedition. The sedition being that he preached a sermon against a covenant of works and for a covenant of grace, which is exactly the same message that Anne and Cotton and others had been espousing. So Wheelwright is banished for sedition, and not only that, some of his supporters, about 60 people, signed a petition asking that that be overturned, his conviction be overturned. That petition gave the leadership, the government, a list of people to go take firearms from. That was the result of signing that petition. They were not successful in overturning that, and the government said, this might be the list of people who are ready to act, who are going to be dangerous to us. And so they just went ahead and preemptively seized their firearms. There was not, this is before America was established as the nation, the United States. And so there is no Second Amendment right here. And so their ability to defend themselves was taken from them just for signing a petition asking that this preacher be allowed to continue to preach. So after they've gotten that done, they put Anne on trial and ultimately banished her. The accounts of the trial demonstrate that she was able to outwit and outtalk her accusers, but they banished her anyway. And she even said, wait, hang on, what's going on here? Why am I being found guilty? Like, we've been in discussion about this for a long time, and it sort of seemed like I was going to be all right. So why am I being found guilty? And Winthrop just said, the court knows why, and that's all that matters. They wouldn't even really discuss it with her or tell her why she was being banished. She was held prisoner apart from her family. So she's got all these children, and she's not even allowed to be with them or take care of things at home. She is held prisoner apart from her family until she was able to travel to her banishment. She was also excommunicated from the church itself. John Wilson was the minister of the Boston Church. Reverend John Cotton, her preacher from England, from home, who encouraged her to come over, also condemned her publicly at this time. He just, he could see the writing on the wall. He knew that this was not a good thing. This is what he was trying to get away from in England. And so he severed his ties with her and condemned her publicly as well. But John Wilson was very harsh. He said, I deliver you unto Satan, and in the name of Jesus Christ in this church, I command you to leave as a leper. withdraw yourself as a leper. And that was extremely harsh, and probably hurtful for Anne. I don't know that, but my imagination, it was probably not a comfortable time in her life. Now, meanwhile, while all this was going on, in the background, secretly, a group of the supporters of this um, covenant of grace and of Anne Hutchinson, they got together and started looking for another place to live. The handwriting was on the wall. They knew that they were going to have to leave, and so they did. They formed the Portsmouth Compact. That's how this came to be. They got together and said, hey, we are all going to come together and form a body politic. And within that, there was a rule in Portsmouth that said no person within this said colony at any time shall be any wise molested, punished, disquieted, called in for questioning, or for any differences in opinion or in matters of religion. And this is the undertone of our Declaration of Independence. So, way back here in the 1630s, this is where we're starting to see those threads of, freedom for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, freedom of speech, those kinds of things. That all can be traced back to this time frame and this group of people who left for this reason. So Anne's banished, her group leaves, and they find refuge in what is today Rhode Island. They leave in the spring of 1638. It is a 60-mile journey to where they end up. William served as a judge and continued her teaching, and life was good, except that in Boston, the whole thing was not over. Boston began to punish or prosecute women for crimes 3.5 times the rate they did before Anne. They saw that as Rhode Island prospered, it was threatening to them. And so all of the people who left Boston for Rhode Island, Boston began to go to them and trying to get them to come back, to continue to be members in good standing. And they began efforts to annex that Rhode Island area as part of Massachusetts. Now, this was terrifying for Anne and her family. They had to flee. They had people around them who were being severely punished. And so they knew they had to get out now of Rhode Island because they could not be annexed back into Massachusetts. They could not risk that. And so they left. Now, 5 adult children stayed behind in Boston and Rhode Island. 7 children moved to New Netherland. All of this occurred about 1642 or in 1642. They leased land near Brooklyn and built a house in today's Eastchester. But William sadly died about this time. He had been her constant companion. Even John Winthrop said he was an honest and peaceable man of good estate, and he died. I found a court record that gives evidence of his death time. This is from October 1642. And again, I'm not doing anything magical. I'm doing basic research, just like we all do for the 1840s and 1900s. I'm just looking at court records, and I'm having to use some indexes because those original records are not accessible to me. But that's okay. And I find this recording that Mr. Rochester was the plaintiff against Widow Hutchinson, and that's phonetic. It's a phonetic spelling of Hutchinson, but it says she was the executrix to William Hutchinson, who, that's the defendant. He's claiming against the estate damages of 16 pounds. It's just a debt that's owed by the estate. He files for it in court, and the debt gets paid. So We know that he had died by this time. She's called a widow. And also, John Winthrop had noted in his journal that he had died by 1642. Now, I think that William made that move to New Netherland, or was in the process of it, or had set up that move for Anne and the children to New Netherland. The reason I think that is because they had that lease. Remember that lease that we just looked at? They had the lease where they were living near Brooklyn, but building the house in Eastchester. And then there's a letter that was written in 1654 by someone named Mary Purdy. She is writing to her uncle. And all we have is this transcript of this letter that's left. But I'm thankful to have this. This is using resources available through history associations and genealogy associations, and things that they had that they preserved. But she says she's telling her uncle about her brother John, and she says, my brother John sold his land in Fairfield and moved to where Mr. Hutchinson's plantation was. So she is attributing this plantation in that area to Mr. Hutchinson and not Anne herself. And so I think that William at least started this move or laid the foundation for the move. I don't think that Anne went all on her own, just randomly decided to move there. But she certainly had to complete the process because William died. So she moves to New Netherland. But what Anne didn't know was that the Native Americans who lived there did not agree to sell her that land. The Dutch had a habit of brokering deals on one side. They were taking money from settlers for pieces of land that they represented as being sold by Native Americans to the settlers, but they weren't completing that deal with the Native Americans. And so the Native Americans just perceived that people were moving into their land or moving into their area and taking over and pushing them out. And that was not okay. That set up a lot of animosity and a lot of tension. At the same time, William Kieft was the Director General of New Netherland, and he had started a war with the Native Americans in the area at that time. In 1643, he attacked, and 120 Native Americans were massacred in retaliation for that. It took them a little time, a few months, but in retaliation for that, 1,500 Native Americans in turn invaded and destroyed, razed, flattened 20 years of development. They came back with a vengeance. Now, Anne believed, because she was an advocate for Native Americans and she had been friends with them for a number of years and lived peaceably with them, and believed that they had a right to live where they did and to have a happy life, and that they should not be bothered. She believed that they knew this and that she would be okay. But that's not the case. John Winthrop's journal again informs us that near the Dutch, that the English who were living near the Dutch were set upon, that the Native Americans came to Mrs. Hutchinson's house under the pretense of friendliness and neighborliness, but they turned on her. They approached her in a friendly way, but then they turned on her and they killed her and all of her family. They even put their cattle into the houses and burned the entire place down. And so it was believed that the remainder of the Hutchinson family who had moved to New Netherland had been killed. 3 years later, they learned that Susanna Hutchinson, Anne's daughter, had actually lived through the massacre, that they did not kill her. And they did not learn this until a peace treaty was brokered between the Dutch and the Native Americans 3 years later. And the Native Americans were like, oh, we'll trade you back, Susanna Hutchinson, as part of the peace treaty. And so Winthrop describes this. He says that she had been about 8 years old when she was taken, that she was returned to her family in Boston, but by that time she had forgotten her own language and she had forgotten her family, and that it was a very difficult adjustment for her to make when she came back. So, that's a huge uh, piece of information that we get from John Winthrop's journal. Just doing that manuscript reading, being hugely informative. Now, I wondered what happened to Susanna. And so, again, doing that local research, just drilling down in the location, I found through Ancestry and Family Search that she married John Cole in 1651. Now, who's John Cole? John Cole's father, Samuel, came over with Winthrop. He opened the first tavern, and it was called Cole's Inn. But remember that group of people who stood up for John Wheelwright? He was one of them, and his firearms were taken. He suffered a lot of opposition after that, and he eventually had to sell his business, but he stayed in Boston. He was right here at this blue square. That's where Cole's Inn, drawn here, was located. So he had to leave the central part of Boston, and he lost a lot of standing for being a supporter of Anne and John Wheelwright. Susanna goes on, and they have their first child in 1653. They move to Rhode Island, and they have 10 more children and live a full life. So her story has a good ending, whereas certainly her childhood was traumatic. The state of Massachusetts came back and eventually sort of made amends with Anne much later. She has a statue erected at the Massachusetts State House where she is here depicted with Susanna, and it says that this is in memory of her, that she was a courageous exponent of civil liberty. So again, I had no special knowledge when I started out on this. I was looking for Anne Hutchinson and just information about her. But what I learned about doing colonial records research is that you really need to research the history and the religions in the area at the time. If you don't know the religion of your ancestor, look at all of them. Just read as much as you can about the history and about the religion that is in the area at the time. Your ancestor may not have stayed in that location. So if you don't find them there, spread out, reach out to area locations and look for them there and read that history, see where people went from one location to the next. You can expect some gaps in records because, again, we're reaching way far back in time, but just know that that's okay. If you find gaps in records, that's okay. Don't get frustrated. Keep going. Always conduct a records survey to prevent yourself from being frustrated about wondering what is surviving as far as records in that area and what is not. One great place to start is the Research in the States series by the National Genealogical Society, and looking for that area where your ancestor was. This is going to give you a lot of really good background information, and these publications are affordable. Legacy Family Tree Webinars is also a great education source. They have a lot of webinars where you can go in and search by topic. Now, at the top of this presentation, Kate was telling us about the resources there that they have. They have, I think she said, over 200 webinars. That would be a wonderful place to look and to continue to watch here in the Allen County resources for more colonial programs that are being presented. Great resources. And that's a very reputable, reliable resource that's available for education. if you're on Ancestry, did you know? Even if you're not on Ancestry, Ancestry Academy is available. It is also another place for webinars that are very informative, and they have little tiny short ones that may be 5 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, and they have much longer ones over an hour about a lot of different topics. So certainly check them out. Specifically for New England research, the New England Historic Genealogical Society is available, and they have a website called American Ancestors, and they have a lot of tools there, including the 17th Century New England Research Guide. This is a paid source. So it is, and it is not, it is a little pricier, but it is really good information as well.